So today we're going to be examining a figure whose moral authority and really whose political evolution profoundly shaped the 20th century, Martin Luther King Jr. The stack of sources we have here provides a very full, unvarnished view of his life. It stretches across every facet, from his earliest encounters with trauma and his intellectual development to his greatest public triumphs and the radicalization of his economic vision, and also the crushing 5-year campaign of state coercion that was aimed at silencing him. So this is more than just a historical review. We're really trying to get at the sheer complexity of a man who willingly absorbed monumental pressure in his quest to challenge the very foundation of American life.
That's exactly right. And our mission today is very focused. We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from this material for you, our listener, so you can quickly get up to speed on the architecture of his journey. We want to understand that unwavering commitment to nonviolent resistance, the critical way his political views evolved far beyond those initial civil rights goals into a critique of capitalism and militarism, and of course the staggering level of hostile surveillance he endured. I mean, appreciating the full scope of the public and, the covert forces that were arrayed against him is absolutely essential to grasping his legacy.
And speaking of understanding that journey, we have to start with a surprising biographical detail. It instantly places his life within a context of, well, global resistance. Most people know him as Martin Luther King Jr., but that wasn't the name he was born with. He was actually born Michael King Jr.
That is a detail that's just so rich with historical context, because the name change itself is rooted in a reaction to global racial oppression. Martin Luther King Jr. was born Michael King Jr. in Atlanta in January 1929. His father, Michael King Sr., traveled a year to 1934 to attend the Fifth Congress of the Baptist World Alliance. And during this trip, he visited Germany and observed the terrifying ascent of the Nazi regime.
This was 1934, so Hitler's power was rapidly consolidating.
Precisely. And inspired by the legacy of the Reformation leader, Martin Luther, and reacting directly to the rise of Nazism's racial hatred, Michael King Sr. changed his own name and his 5-year-old son's name to Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. The Baptist World Alliance Congress itself adopted this powerful resolution condemning all racial animosity and every form of oppression or unfair discrimination. So you see, that name change wasn't just a simple clerical matter. It was an early, powerful public rejection of global racial tyranny, establishing a foundation of confrontation that really defined the rest of his life.
That moment sets such a powerful theme. The fight for dignity began right within his family and his home, even in segregated Atlanta. So let's get into the foundations that shaped him, both the protections and, of course, the cruel realities of the Jim Crow South.
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929. He was the middle child, with an older sister, Christine King Ferris, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel King, who everyone just called A.D. And while his family life was very protective and loving, King was, inevitably steeped in the daily reality of racial humiliation that the South enforced. We have a really poignant anecdote from his childhood when he was about 6 years old. His white childhood friend was abruptly forbidden to play with him once they started school. The friend's parents were explicit, saying, "We are white and you are colored."
And that's the moment where theory becomes reality for a child. How did his parents navigate that shock and confusion for him?
It was a defining moment. When young Martin Jr. told them what happened, his parents spoke with him frankly about the entire history of American slavery and racism. King later wrote that this discussion initially made him determined to hate every white person, end quote. But his parents immediately and firmly countered that feeling. They instructed him that it was his Christian duty to love everyone. This created an internal moral tension from the earliest age. You have this understandable anger generated by injustice, but it's countered by the theological and moral imperative of Christian love. And really, that tension would become the engine of his nonviolent movement.
Right, and his father, Martin Luther King Sr., wasn't just preaching love. He was actively modeling direct, uncompromising resistance against the system he was forced to live under.
Oh, he was a model of defiance. There's a famous example from a shoe store in downtown Atlanta. Martin Sr. took Martin Jr. in to buy shoes, and the clerk immediately directed them to sit in the back, adhering to segregation customs. Martin Sr. refused. He asserted that they would sit in the front or not purchase shoes at all. He then delivered that ringing quote to his son: "We'll either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all." He walked out and he told Martin Jr., "I don't care how long I had to live with this system, I will never accept it." This was active, non-cooperative defiance that King Jr. internalized. And on top of that, Martin Sr. led hundreds of African Americans in a 1936 civil rights march to Atlanta's City Hall, specifically to protest voting rights discrimination. So it established this clear, multi-generational lineage of activism.
Moving from these external pressures to his internal and emotional world, the source material notes instances of profound personal trauma during his childhood, which are difficult to acknowledge. It really speaks to the extreme emotional sensitivity and stress he carried from a very young age.
Yes, the public persona of strength it was built upon a foundation of intense emotional struggle. The records detailed two specific instances of attempted suicide, both deeply linked to his maternal grandmother, Jenny, whom he affectionately called Mama. The first incident happened when he was about 6. He was playing with his younger brother, A.D., who slid down a banister and struck Jenny, causing her to fall unresponsive. Believing she had died and blaming himself for her perceived injury, Martin Jr. attempted suicide by jumping from a second-story window. He survived and, thankfully, immediately recovered after hearing she was still alive.
That just speaks to an immediate, profound self-blame and grief, and the second attempt followed her actual death years later.
It did. On May 18, 1941, when King was 12, he had sneaked away from home to watch a parade, ignoring his studying duties. When he returned, he learned that Jenny had suffered a heart attack and died while being transported to the hospital. He fixated on his deception, the belief that his disobedience in going to the parade may have been the catalyst for God taking her. And in this overwhelming grief and guilt, he again jumped from a second-story window. While his father later insisted he was not to blame, this trauma confirms a deeply sensitive nature and an emotional intensity that would later manifest as immense personal stress under the pressures of the movement.
And we see that intellectual and emotional intensity translate rapidly into his academic life. He entered college at an exceptionally young age.
His intellectual maturity was undeniable. He skipped the 9th grade. In the autumn of 1944, at just 15 years old, he enrolled at Morehouse College, partly due to the college accepting juniors who passed entrance exams to boost enrollment during World War II. But importantly, the summer before college, he took a job in Simsbury, Connecticut, working at a tobacco farm. This trip was revolutionary because it was his first extended exposure to the non-segregated North.
And coming from Jim Crow Atlanta, what was that experience like for him?
It was an immediate revelation, a powerful affirmation that a different America was possible. He wrote home to his father, expressing his amazement. He noted that after we passed Washington, there was no discrimination at all. He detailed how he could freely go to one of the finest restaurants in Hartford and that Negroes and whites go to the same church. This early firsthand experience provided a tangible vision of life without segregation, and it reinforced his moral commitment and provided a clear, achievable goal for the movement he would eventually lead.
Meanwhile, his intellectual path to the ministry was, well, it was fraught with doubt. He didn't initially embrace the emotional faith he saw practiced around him.
That's a key distinction. He was fundamentally a rationalist. As early as age 13, he denied the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus during Sunday school. He really struggled to reconcile the emotional fervor of his father's Baptist church with his own intellectual needs, stating that he doubted if he would ever attain personal satisfaction from religion. He felt the church was too often too emotional, and that his theological studies needed to be intellectually grounded.
So why choose the ministry at all, then?
Well, he eventually chose the ministry because he realized he could merge his passion for social justice with his intellectual rigor. He wanted to be a rational minister who would use sermons not just for abstract theology, but as a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. He sought to integrate the theology of the social gospel, this idea that Christian ethics must address social and political issues, into his pulpit.
Yeah.
This path took him through Morehouse, Crozer Theological Seminary for his Bachelor of Divinity in 1951, and then it culminated in his Ph.D. in Systematic Theology from Boston University in 1955.
And before he fully embraced the theological framework of nonviolence, specifically the influence of Gandhi, he actually experienced it in action. Let's connect his developing sense of rational protest with that early incident in New Jersey.
This is a crucial, often forgotten narrative thread. In June 1950, while he was attending Crozer Theological Seminary, King and some classmates and their dates went to a place called Mary's Cafe in Mapleshade, New Jersey. They specifically chose this establishment because they were warned black customers were unwelcome. They sat down and refused to leave after being refused service, asserting their rights under New Jersey's anti-discrimination law. This is a classic act of civil disobedience.
And the escalation was immediate and dangerous.
It was life-threatening. After refusing to leave, And after the owner refused to even serve them ginger ales, the owner, a man named Ernest Nichols, left the counter. He returned with a gun, which he fired into the air, reportedly shouting, "I'd kill for less." King and his classmates ran out, genuinely fearing for their lives. The importance of this incident is that it showed King firsthand the intense hostility that nonviolent defiance could provoke, even when protected by law, and it confirmed his innate willingness to risk himself for a just cause.
Right. And just to clarify the chronology here, King hadn't yet fully absorbed the theoretical basis of Gandhian non-resistance at this time.
That is correct. The Mary's Cafe incident happened 6 months before he was formally exposed to the concepts of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience by Mahatma Gandhi. He later heard a lecture by Mordecai Johnson detailing how Gandhi successfully integrated Henry David Thoreau's philosophy of non-cooperation into a massive, practical resistance movement. So King's practical experience of defiant non-cooperation was already in place. The formal intellectual theory later provided the powerful, enduring philosophical grounding for the entire civil rights movement.
So now we move to what is really the turning point in his career, when King was abruptly thrust onto the national stage in Montgomery, Alabama, a moment that defined his strategic commitment to nonviolence.
Right. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 is the flashpoint, but it's vital to acknowledge, you said, that it was built upon earlier, equally brave actions. The arrest of Claudette Colvin earlier that year had already set the stage.
Exactly. Claudette Colvin, a black schoolgirl, had already refused to give up her bus seat back in March of 1955.
But it was the arrest of Rosa Parks in December 1955 that served as the definitive organizational spark. Local community leaders, most notably a man named Edgar Nixon, pushed for a comprehensive bus boycott. King, as the relatively new, dynamic pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, was urged to lead the movement. The existing leadership reasoned that because he was new to community leadership, it would make it easier for him to step forward and speak out without being bogged down by older local political conflicts.
Leading the boycott instantly elevated him and, at the same time, exposed him to profound violence.
The exposure was immense, and the personal risk was immediate. The boycott lasted an impressive 385 days. During this time, the segregationist backlash was violent. King's house was bombed, which illustrates the physical danger nonviolent resistance often provoked. He was arrested multiple times, sometimes for just ludicrous infractions, which nevertheless amplified his stature. For example, he was jailed simply for traveling 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. The boycott finally ended when the federal system intervened. The U.S. District Court ruled that racial segregation on Montgomery public buses was illegal, in the case of Browder v. Gale, demonstrating the power of organized, protracted non-cooperation to force legal change.
Following that success, King and other leaders realized that these localized actions were insufficient. They needed a national vehicle to expand the struggle.
That organizational need led directly to the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, in 1957. King co-founded it with key figures like Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth. The core mission was to systematically harness the immense moral authority and, the organizational infrastructure that's inherent in black churches across the South for organized nonviolent protest campaigns.
This model certainly proved successful, but the sources make it clear that the movement faced serious setbacks that provided critical strategic lessons. The Albany movement is the prime example of that.
The Albany movement in Georgia from 1961 to 1962 was a major, painful setback for the SCLC. It failed partly due to internal divisions within the black community, but strategically it failed because of the calculated response of Police Chief Laurie Pritchett. Pritchett employed what was called a canny, low-key response. He was sophisticated enough to understand that King's strategy required violence to gain media traction.
So he intentionally denied King the spectacle.
Exactly. Pritchett specifically avoided the use of brutal televised violence, ordering his officers to be outwardly courteous to protesters. Crucially, when he made mass arrests, and there were thousands, he arranged for the protesters to be managed quietly and dispersed across multiple jails in surrounding counties. By refusing to create the dramatic, crisis-packed, violence-filled situation that King's nonviolent tactics relied on for national media attention, Pritchett just diffused the movement's pressure. After Albany, King learned that the SCLC needed to choose engagement locations where they could almost guarantee that the opposition would react violently and create the necessary national media crisis.
And that critical learning curve led directly to the confrontation in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, a campaign that was specifically designed to provoke that extreme, violent response.
Yes. Birmingham was chosen because it was notoriously the most segregated city in the South, and it was overseen by the aggressively segregationist Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor. The SCLC intentionally employed highly confrontational, nonviolent tactics designed to fill the jails, provoke the authorities, and force a crisis-packed situation that would compel local negotiation and federal intervention. When the initial protests involving adults failed to gain the necessary traction, SCLC strategist James Bevel introduced the controversial and highly effective tactic known as the Children's Crusade, recruiting hundreds of children and young adults to participate in the demonstrations and face arrest.
The resulting images from Birmingham shocked the conscience of the nation and fundamentally altered public opinion, particularly among Northern whites.
The footage was undeniably horrific. Bull Connor responded to the Children's Crusade by deploying police dogs and high-pressure water jets against the protesters, including children as young as 6. The images were broadcast nationally and globally, visually confirming the sheer brutality of the segregationist defense. And during the campaign, King himself was arrested and jailed.
And that incarceration produced one of the most powerful critiques of the American system penned in the modern era, his Letter from Birmingham Jail.
It's an intellectual and moral masterpiece. It was written in response to 8 local white Alabama clergymen who had published an open letter urging King to slow down and wait. King used the letter to argue so eloquently that justice cannot wait, famously writing, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed."
But his sharpest, most enduring critique was directed at the complacent.
Absolutely. His most famous passage in the letter skewers the white moderate, describing the person who is more devoted to order than to justice. King argued that this moderate was a greater obstacle to racial progress than the outright segregationist because they prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. He believed the moderate was structurally complicit by prioritizing comfortable stasis over necessary confrontation. The Birmingham campaign ultimately succeeded, leading to Connor's removal and the removal of Jim Crow signs from public places.
The success of Birmingham laid the essential groundwork for the massive demonstration later that year, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Yes, King was recognized as one of the Big Six leaders organizing the event. It was an organizational marvel, successfully bringing together 250,000 people of diverse ethnicities, making it the largest gathering of protesters in D.C. history up to that point. But the sources remind us that this unity required some intense political maneuvering behind the scenes.
Specifically, President Kennedy was deeply apprehensive about the march. He feared it would create chaos and jeopardize the civil rights legislation he was trying to push through Congress.
Correct. Kennedy's administration put enormous pressure on the organizers. In response, the leadership ultimately acquiesced to a significant compromise. They toned down the initial, strident tone of the march, which had planned to openly denounce the government for failing to protect civil rights workers and enact meaningful change. This compromise was strategic, but it drew heavy criticism.
Which validated critics like Malcolm X, who called it the farce on Washington.
It did. Malcolm X criticized the march for having its radical edges dulled by establishment influence. Despite these internal tensions, though, the march put forth a strong set of specific structural demands that went far beyond mere integration.
What were some of those key economic and legal demands put forward that day?
The agenda was complex. They demanded an end to segregation in public schools, protection for civil rights workers from violence, the prohibition of racial discrimination in employment, and a significant economic demand for a $2 minimum wage for all workers. It was a comprehensive agenda aimed at achieving both legal and economic parity.
And the march concluded with what is arguably the defining speech of the 20th century.
King delivered the iconic "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. What's fascinating is that the most quoted passage, where he speaks of his children being judged by the content of their character, was actually an improvised departure from his prepared text. Sources suggest this improvisation may have been prompted by the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who reportedly shouted behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." The profound power of that speech and the size of the demonstration helped ensure that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became a legislative priority.
By 1965, King and the SCLC had largely secured the legislative victories regarding voting rights and public accommodations, thanks in part to the success of Selma. But the sources reveal a crucial pivot. King realized that legal equality was meaningless without economic justice. This fundamentally expanded his struggle and put him into conflict with the power structure of the entire nation, not just the South.
That's the key shift. And this shift required confronting structural poverty and housing discrimination in the urban North. The prime example was the Chicago open housing movement in 1966. To demonstrate solidarity and commitment, King and Ralph Abernathy moved into a dilapidated slum apartment in the North Lawndale neighborhood. This was an intentional educational experience for the movement to understand the deep-rooted exploitation faced by the urban poor, trapped by discriminatory housing and employment practices.
So, did the nonviolent methods translate successfully to the Northern context?
Tragically, no. King later stated that the Chicago protests were met with a worse and more ferocious reception than anything he had faced in the Deep South. Marches in Chicago were met with hostile, screaming crowds who threw bricks and bottles. King himself was struck by a brick during one march. This raw experience reinforced his belief that the problems in the North, institutionalized racism and economic exploitation, were structural and perhaps more entrenched and visceral than the explicit Jim Crow laws of the South.
His moral concerns then extended beyond domestic poverty and inequality to the global sphere, culminating in his dramatic opposition to the war in Vietnam. This was a massive political risk, given his relationship with President Johnson.
It was an enormous risk. King initially avoided criticizing the Vietnam War, fearing that alienating President Johnson would jeopardize his ongoing civil rights goals and legislative achievements. However, he was increasingly urged by figures like STLC strategist James Bevel, and King reached a point where he felt a moral obligation to speak out. In April 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, he delivered the landmark Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence speech at New York City's Riverside Church.
And in that speech, he didn't just limit his critique to foreign policy, he framed the war as a symptom of a deeper American pathology.
He connected racism, poverty, and militarism in what he called the giant triplets of destruction. He argued the U.S. presence in Vietnam was intended to occupy it as an American colony. His most explosive charge was calling the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. His moral critique was fundamentally rooted in resource allocation. He pointed out that the war diverted massive funds from domestic social welfare programs, declaring that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
And the political consequences of this moral stance were immediate and severe.
They were immediate and devastating to his alliances. King lost significant support among key white allies, including President Johnson, the powerful evangelist Billy Graham, and influential labor leaders and media publishers. The widely read Life magazine, reflecting the mainstream backlash, referred to the speech as demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. King was dismayed by the hypocrisy, observing that people applauded his nonviolence when it was directed against the violence of Bull Connor, but suddenly deplored it when it was applied toward little brown Vietnamese children.
It's important to note how this global stance also connected him with other world peace figures.
It did. His opposition to the war led to his deep correspondence and eventual meeting with the influential Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who had been urging King to publicly denounce the conflict. King was so moved by the monk's commitment to peace that he nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize, calling him one of the most worthy, because his ideas for peace would build a monument to ecumenism, to world brotherhood, to humanity.
Shifting back to his final vision for America, King's economic philosophy was highly radical for the time and went far beyond the liberal consensus. He was looking at fundamental structural change.
Yeah, absolutely. King rejected both the unchecked individualism of laissez-faire capitalism and the political totalitarianism of Soviet communism. He had read Marx extensively, but dismissed communism's, quote, materialistic interpretation of history. He described his own developing economic theory in a 1952 letter to Coretta Scott as much more socialistic than capitalistic.
So what were the inherent flaws he saw in the American capitalist system?
He was highly critical of the profit motive overriding human needs. He stated plainly that something is wrong with capitalism and advocated that America must move toward a democratic socialism. He criticized the vast economic inequality, noting the stark paradox that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. King argued that to truly conquer the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism, the whole structure of American life must be changed.
This sweeping vision led directly to his final ambitious project, the Poor People's Campaign.
Yes, the Poor People's Campaign, organized in 1968, was an attempt to confront this structural economic injustice directly through nonviolent direct action. It sought to mobilize a multiracial army of the poor, including Black, white, Hispanic, and Native American citizens, to nonviolently occupy Washington, D.C., demanding an economic bill of rights from the federal government. His vision included radical ideas like full employment and housing. In his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? King cited the work of economist Henry George in supporting the concept of a guaranteed basic income, which just shows how deeply he was looking at systemic solutions.
And how did he frame the concept of compensation or reparations for historical wrongs?
He advocated for a large-scale governmental compensatory program of about $50 billion over 10 years. He framed this not as a direct restitution for slavery, which he deemed impossible to calculate, but as a remedial program designed to close the economic gap created by historical wrongs and systemic denial of opportunity. And crucially, he insisted this compensation should go to all disadvantaged groups, not exclusively Black Americans. He recognized that poverty was a multiracial problem, but framed Black Americans as the group deserving of this compensation due to the specific historical debt. He argued this program was justified because of the spectacular long-term decline it would cause in crime, poverty, and other social ills, ultimately benefiting the entire nation.
As we move into this next section, we really have to emphasize that the unrelenting surveillance and harassment King endured was a coordinated, hostile campaign by government agencies. It was intended not just to monitor, but to actively destroy his effectiveness and credibility as a leader. We're looking at a calculated, deliberate act of coercion against an American citizen.
And the extent of the FBI's campaign to neutralize him is truly staggering, driven largely by the intense personal obsession of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover considered King a dangerous radical, even a communist front, despite lacking any evidence. The campaign spanned 5 years, from 1963 until his assassination in 1968. The subsequent 1975 Church Committee investigation by Congress confirmed the FBI conducted an intensive campaign to neutralize him as an effective civil rights leader. This was a formal acknowledgement of systematic government abuse of power.
And the initial justification for the surveillance was flimsy, related to one of King's advisors, but Hoover quickly used that as a pretense to widen the net exponentially.
That's exactly what happened. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy initially authorized limited wiretapping in the fall of 1963 because King had ties to Stanley Levison, who was suspected of past involvement with the Communist Party USA. Kennedy and his brother feared this association would be weaponized by segregationists to derail civil rights legislation. But Hoover drastically extended this clearance beyond its scope, deciding his men were unshackled to investigate King's entire private life for any potential leverage. This surveillance quickly led to the SCLC being targeted directly under the notorious COINTELPRO operation, which was a campaign of disruption.
Yes.
Hoover formally listed the SCLC as a Black nationalist hate group, a designation entirely inconsistent with SCLC's founding nonviolent philosophy, and issued explicit instructions to agents. No opportunities should be missed to exploit through counterintelligence techniques the organizational and personal conflicts to ensure the group was disrupted, ridiculed, or discredited. They bugged his homes, his offices, his hotel rooms across the country, turning whatever they found into weapons.
And the most egregious and horrifying example of this coercion was the infamous anonymous suicide letter King received.
It's just chilling. In 1964, just before King was due to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI mailed him an anonymous, threatening letter alongside tapes derived from their extensive surveillance of his private life. The letter was a grotesque attempt to break his spirit and force him out of leadership, ending with a direct threat. "You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it." King understood this immediately as an attempt to drive him to suicide. While the FBI later offered justifications, the discovery of the uncensored letter reveals their desire to remove him and replace him with a more moderate leader.
It's clear that beyond the FBI, the surveillance was pervasive, involving multiple levels of government.
Absolutely pervasive. The monitoring was national and local. Local police agencies in Birmingham, Philadelphia, New York City, and Chicago extensively monitored his movements and activities. Even in Memphis, just before his assassination in 1968, police officers were strategically stationed across from the Lorraine Motel at a fire station, explicitly keeping King under surveillance. In a stunning detail, an undercover police officer was actually the first person to administer first aid to him immediately after he was shot.
And the high-level intelligence agencies also monitored him, linking his domestic activism to his anti-war position.
That falls under the National Security Agency. The NSA monitored King's international communications under a secret operation codenamed Minaret. This operation specifically targeted leading Americans, including King, who were critical of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. An internal NSA review later characterized this secret operation as disreputable, if not outright illegal, due to its targeting of Americans. And despite years of this extensive, intrusive surveillance across multiple agencies, the FBI itself finally acknowledged by 1976 that they had obtained no evidence that King himself or the SCLC were actually involved with any communist organizations.
We also have to address the personal and academic controversies that were exacerbated, if not entirely generated, by this campaign of intense opposition.
Right. The academic issue concerned plagiarism. An academic inquiry was launched at Boston University in 1991, which confirmed that portions of his 1955 doctoral dissertation were indeed used without appropriate citation. However, the committee chose not to revoke his Ph.D. They acknowledged that the dissertation still made an intelligent contribution to scholarship, but they attached a note to the library copy detailing the issue. It remains an important detail of his intellectual history.
Regarding his personal life, the FBI's surveillance was purely focused on gathering material on alleged extramarital affairs, which they then used as a weapon.
Yes, the FBI widely distributed reports of alleged affairs to his allies, funding sources, and the press, purely to discredit him as part of COINTELPRO. Historians who have examined this material note that King struggled profoundly with the burden of leadership and suffered overwhelming guilt over these relationships, which were sometimes described as a desperate form of anxiety reduction from the relentless pressures he faced. It is telling that his wife, Coretta Scott King, reportedly handled these allegations with equanimity, stating that all that other business just doesn't have a place in the very high-level relationship we enjoyed.
Finally, we have to mention the highly controversial, unsubstantiated allegation that emerged much later regarding an FBI handwritten note, making clear why historical experts reject its reliability.
Yes. In 2019, an FBI file excerpt surfaced containing a handwritten note alleging that King watched a friend rape a woman, laughing and offering advice. It is absolutely vital to stress that historians who are expert in King's work, such as Professors Thea Harris and Carson, have widely dismissed this claim as highly unreliable. As Carson, who oversees King's documents, pointed out, the alleged new information was 4 layers removed from the actual recording. It comes from an anonymous single-paragraph summary within a deeply biased COINTELPRO report whose entire purpose was King's destruction. This has to be seen through the lens of the FBI's established campaign to slander him. The actual audio tapes that could potentially confirm or refute the various allegations regarding his personal life remain sealed by court order until 2027.
The unrelenting pressure and stress King faced culminated so tragically in Memphis in April 1968 as he pursued his final campaign focused explicitly on labor rights and economic dignity.
This was the sanitation workers' strike, a purely economic and human dignity struggle, which just confirms his shift toward that poor people's campaign agenda. King arrived in Memphis on March 29, 1968, to support black sanitation workers represented by AFS-CME Local 1733. They were striking for basic recognition, higher wages, and better treatment. For instance, white workers were paid for a full day after bad weather, while black workers were only paid for 2 hours or sent home unpaid. This campaign was a clear expression of his expanded focus on the Economic Bill of Rights.
And the night before his death, he delivered his prophetic mountaintop speech, which, when you view it retrospectively, is just heartbreaking in its premonition.
The speech was delivered on April 3, 1968, at Mason Temple, after his flight to Memphis had been delayed by a bomb threat. He referenced the constant threats against him directly, saying, "I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop." He then delivered the famous lines that endure. "I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land."
That prophecy was fulfilled in the most tragic way the following day.
Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at 6:01 p.m. on Thursday, April 4, 1968, as he stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The bullet struck him in the cheek, tore through his spinal cord, and lodged in his shoulder. He died just over an hour later at St. Joseph's Hospital. It's a profound tragedy, compounded by the autopsy findings. Despite being only 39 years old, the doctors revealed that he had the heart of a 60-year-old, a fact attributed directly by his biographer to the relentless, crushing stress of the movement and the state surveillance he had endured.
The aftermath of his assassination was instantaneous and explosive. It led to violence across the country, but also spurred critical legislative action as a tribute to his legacy.
Yes, King's death ignited widespread race riots in dozens of U.S. cities, including Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. The scale of the national shock and mourning, coupled with the immediate violence, spurred the quick passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, often known as the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination in housing. This legislation was directly pushed through Congress as a tribute to King's final years of struggle against residential discrimination. And on top of that, the Memphis sanitation strike was quickly settled on terms favorable to the workers.
Although James Earl Ray was convicted, the assassination remains surrounded by persistent conspiracy theories, often fueled by the public knowledge of the FBI's prior antagonism toward King.
Right. Ray confessed in March 1969, but recanted 3 days later, and he spent the rest of his life attempting to secure a trial. The theories persist, and in a notable development in 1999, the King family actually won a civil wrongful death claim against a Memphis restaurant owner named Lloyd Jowers and unknown co-conspirators. In that civil case, the jury found government agencies complicit in the assassination.
But the federal government's subsequent investigation contradicted those civil findings.
That is correct. In 2000, the U.S. Department of Justice completed its own investigation into Jowers' claims and found no credible evidence of conspiracy, recommending no further investigation. The DOJ report noted that a key witness who corroborated Jowers' conspiracy story later admitted she had fabricated the details for money. So the conspiracy element remains an active debate, with researchers holding conflicting views on the validity of the civil trial's findings.
At his funeral, at his widow's request, King's final sermon was played, summarizing the values he wished to be remembered for.
The sermon was The Drum Major Instinct, delivered just 2 months before his death. In it, King articulated his hope for his own legacy. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. Say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness.
Decades later, his legacy has expanded globally and institutionally, securing his place in history.
His influence is felt in social movements worldwide. He was cited as critical inspiration for the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, led by Steve Biko, and played a significant role in inspiring the Northern Ireland civil rights movement. In the U.S., his impact is institutional. He is recognized liturgically by the Episcopal Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and was even canonized by the Holy Christian Orthodox Church in 2016. And of course, his legacy is etched onto our calendar with the federal establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 1986.
And on a fascinating cultural note, he had a direct, surprising impact on the future of television representation.
This is a wonderful anecdote. Actress Nichelle Nichols, who played L.T. Uhura on the original Star Trek, planned to leave the show in 1967. She was convinced to stay after a chance meeting with King. He told her that Star Trek was one of the few shows he and Coretta allowed their children to watch, and that her character, L.T. Uhura, represented a future of racial cooperation, an image of possibility he was fighting for. He famously told her, "You are our image of where we're going 300 years from now, and that means that's where we are, and it takes place now. Keep doing what you're doing." This demonstrated his deep understanding of the power of cultural representation in shaping societal views. And finally, on a governmental note, planned redesigns of the $5 bill will feature images from his I Have a Dream speech on the reverse side.
We've traced Martin Luther King Jr.'s extraordinary evolution, beginning with a personal lineage of resistance, moving through public triumphs like Montgomery and Birmingham, and enduring paralyzing state harassment, only to emerge with a final radical shift toward economic justice and global anti-militarism. The sources reveal a man of profound intellect, deep vulnerability, and unmatched moral courage, who paid the ultimate price for his commitment to justice.
What stands out when analyzing this entire body of work is the scope of his final vision. King realized that legal parity was only the first step. His belief that the whole structure of American life must be changed to conquer the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism remains a potent challenge. That vision demands a critical rethinking not just of our civil laws, but of our fundamental economic and global priorities even today. That is the question King ultimately leaves us with.
An essential and deeply necessary examination of the sources.
Thanks for listening.